Jesus revealed Abba, the ancient Aramaic word that dissolves fear instantly. What if one of the most powerful words connected to Jesus was never meant to remain hidden? What if this ancient Aramaic word carried a depth that most people have never fully explored? For centuries, many have heard it only as a simple religious expression, but in its original force, Abba points to something far greater than a translation. It carries intimacy, identity, belonging, trust, surrender, and inner steadiness all at once. And while this word can be reflected through many spiritual and symbolic purposes, today one meaning stands above the rest. Today, we will uncover how Abba speaks directly to fear, and why it can become a language of courage. In the earliest preserved traditions, language was never considered a casual instrument, but a structured pathway connecting memory, discipline, and continuity across generations. The Aramaic language, spoken during the time of J.R.S., maintained expressions that carried meaning beyond literal translation, reflecting a worldview in which stability of thought was cultivated through repetition and remembrance. Within this context, words were used as anchors that reminded individuals of their place within an ordered reality. The term Abba emerges from this environment as more than vocabulary, representing a sound historically associated with certainty, belonging, and confidence rooted in trust. The preservation of this expression across centuries suggests that early communities understood courage as a cultivated state sustained through linguistic continuity. Rather than attempting to construct new concepts, they preserved sounds that reinforced established understanding. Through this perspective, the Aramaic tradition reveals that clarity of thought often begins with clarity of language. When an expression remains consistent across generations, it reflects a shared recognition of its stabilizing role within human experience. By beginning with Abba, this journey restores attention to a classical understanding that courage is strengthened when individuals reconnect with meanings that have endured time. In older traditions, fear was not always confronted through endless explanation, but through remembered truths that reordered the heart and mind. A preserved word could function almost like a returning point, bringing a person back to what was already known to be firm and reliable. That is what gives Abba such force inside this discussion. It is not merely a historical curiosity, and it is not presented here as a decorative term from an ancient language. It is a word tied to relationship, closeness, and the inner certainty that a person is not abandoned in the face of confusion. This is why its role becomes so important when discussing fear. Before courage becomes visible in action, it must first become stable within thought, and in the Aramaic world surrounding Jesus, words like Abba helped create exactly that kind of stability. The full potential of Abba cannot be reduced to only one narrow definition, because this word carries layers that reach into many dimensions of spiritual understanding. It can be associated with intimacy, trust, origin, nearness, identity, dependence, reverence, surrender, belonging, and the restoration of inner order. It is a word used for relationship, but also for orientation. It can point to closeness, but it can also point to recognition. It speaks to dependence, but not in a weak sense. It expresses dependence as alignment with what is higher, stable, and unshaken. This is why Abba can be reflected through many purposes. It can be contemplated in prayer. It can be used as a point of meditation on trust. It can serve as a reminder of identity when a person feels scattered. It can become a spiritual reference in moments of uncertainty. It can even be understood as a way of returning to simplicity when the mind becomes burdened by noise and confusion. Yet among all these dimensions, today we are focusing on one of the strongest: fear and courage. That is because fear often begins when the mind loses its sense of anchoring. A person becomes overwhelmed not only by what is happening outside, but by the inner feeling of being disconnected from security, order, and meaning. This is where Abba takes on extraordinary force. The word does not operate as panic, strain, or urgency. It moves in the opposite direction. It draws the heart back toward trust. It reminds the soul of closeness rather than separation. It restores the perception that one is not left alone before the unknown. And once that perception changes, fear begins to lose its authority. This is why Abba matters so deeply in the language of courage. Courage is not always the loud act of resistance people imagine. In many traditions, true courage begins quietly. When the inner world stops collapsing, the person may still face difficulty, The challenge may still remain, but inside, something has shifted. The mind is no longer ruled by fragmentation. The heart is no longer speaking only the language of threat. Through Abba, courage begins as remembrance. It begins with trust returning to its rightful place. When fear takes hold of a person, it rarely begins as a single event. More often, it grows through layers. It starts with uncertainty, then becomes agitation, then turns into inner instability. After that, perception changes. The mind begins to exaggerate danger. The body begins to anticipate harm, and the spirit begins to feel separated from firmness. In this condition, even small problems can appear enormous, because fear has already altered the way reality is being processed. This is why ancient traditions gave such importance to words that could restore inner order. They understood that before a person can act with strength, they must recover a stable center. Without that center, even truth sounds distant. Without that center, even guidance feels difficult to hold. This is where Abba becomes so meaningful within the path from fear to courage. The force of this word is not based on aggression. It is based on restoration. It does not push the soul into violence against fear. It calls the soul back into alignment beyond fear. And that difference matters. Many people try to overcome fear by fighting it mentally, repeating effort without peace, tension without grounding. But Abba points to another movement. It reminds the heart of closeness. And closeness interrupts isolation. It reminds the mind of trust. And trust interrupts chaos. It restores the sense that beneath visible uncertainty, there is still a greater order that has not collapsed. In this way, courage is no longer built as performance. It is built as return. This makes the message of Abba especially powerful for the theme we are exploring today. The word can carry many purposes. Yes, it can speak into identity, devotion, belonging, and spiritual memory. But when placed directly against fear, its role becomes especially clear. Abba becomes the language of inward steadiness. It becomes the sound of refusing to let confusion become master. It becomes a reminder that the human spirit grows stronger when it returns to what is trustworthy. That is why, in this teaching, courage is not presented as self-created force. It is presented as the fruit of remembered trust, and Abba stands at the center of that remembrance. When fear takes hold of a person, it rarely begins as a single visible event. More often, it forms gradually, layer upon layer, until perception itself becomes influenced by uncertainty. The mind begins to anticipate outcomes that have not yet happened, and the heart begins to respond to possibilities as if they were already reality. In ancient traditions, this process was understood as a form of inner disorientation, a state in which the individual slowly loses connection with what once felt stable and familiar. The Aramaic environment surrounding Jesus preserved expressions designed to interrupt this disorientation by restoring continuity of trust. Among these expressions, Abba occupies a unique place because it reconnects the individual with a sense of nearness rather than distance. Fear often grows when the human being feels separated from protection, meaning, or belonging. The word Abba moves in the opposite direction, reinforcing the perception of closeness and relationship rather than isolation. This restoration of relational perception alters the internal atmosphere, allowing the mind to reorganize itself around stability instead of fragmentation. In traditional understanding, courage was not viewed as the sudden elimination of difficulty, but as the maintenance of orientation while difficulty remained present. This distinction changes the entire perception of strength. Courage becomes less about external display and more about internal continuity. The repetition of Abba reinforces a pattern of thought that reminds the individual that uncertainty does not eliminate structure and challenge does not eliminate meaning. The presence of fear does not automatically mean the absence of support. When the internal language changes, the emotional environment begins to change as well. The person gradually stops interpreting reality only through the lens of threat. Instead, perception begins to include the possibility that stability still exists beneath temporary confusion. Through this lens, Abba becomes associated with the restoration of inner alignment. The word does not operate through pressure or intensity. It operates through continuity, returning the mind to a condition in which trust can exist again. I appreciate your interest in understanding these ancient teachings. To support your study, I made available a free glossary explaining what Gnostic means, along with the main Aramaic words often explored in this channel. The link is in the comments for immediate access. The deeper dimension of Abba becomes clearer when we observe how traditional teachings approach the relationship between language and emotional stability. Words were not selected randomly. They were preserved because they demonstrated the ability to maintain coherence across generations. When a word remained in continuous use, it meant that communities recognized its value in sustaining orientation during uncertainty. The Aramaic context connected to Jesus reflects a culture in which preservation of meaning was considered essential to preservation of identity. Within this framework, Abba represented more than personal expression. It functioned as a reaffirmation of relationship with what was perceived as constant and reliable. When individuals felt shaken by circumstances, the repetition of established expressions helped reorganize attention toward what remained stable. This movement from instability toward continuity gradually weakens the intensity of fear, not bidenio, but by restoring proportion. Although Abba can be explored through many symbolic dimensions, its connection to courage becomes especially evident when the human mind faces the unknown. Fear often amplifies the sense that everything is uncertain at once. Yet traditional teachings consistently emphasize that not everything changes simultaneously. Some principles remain unchanged even when situations shift. The word Abba reflects this perception of permanence. It reminds the individual that continuity still exists, even when external conditions fluctuate. This recognition interrupts the chain reaction that normally intensifies anxiety. When continuity is remembered, reaction begins to slow, and when reaction slows, clarity begins to return. Through this process, courage does not appear suddenly as an emotional surge. It grows gradually, as perception stable. The Aramaic tradition demonstrates that courage becomes sustainable when rooted in continuity rather than intensity. Abba expresses this continuity in linguistic form, allowing the individual to reconnect with stability through remembrance. Along with the free glossary that introduces what Gnostic means and the main Aramaic terms used throughout these teachings, the same link also provides access to 2 complementary ebooks focused on the deeper study of the 2 most important Aramaic words, including structured protocols designed to support continuity in learning. The link is available in the comments. Across preserved teachings, courage was never treated as a temporary emotional impulse, but as the natural consequence of alignment between memory, trust, and continuity. The Aramaic tradition associated with Jesus demonstrates that words were not merely descriptive tools, but stabilizing references that helped individuals remain oriented even when circumstances introduced uncertainty. The presence of Abba within this linguistic heritage illustrates how a single expression can operate as a reminder of relationship rather than isolation. Fear often intensifies when the mind perceives itself as disconnected from structure, support, or meaning. When perception shifts toward separation, inner tension increases, and the individual begins to interpret reality primarily through anticipation of difficulty. The function of Abba is to interrupt this movement by restoring awareness of connection. The word does not attempt to eliminate challenge, but it changes the internal position from which challenge is perceived. In traditional understanding, the repetition of a meaningful word was not considered superstition, but discipline. It represented a deliberate return to established truth, rather than an attempt to invent new certainty in moments of instability. Abba becomes powerful precisely because it redirects attention toward continuity. When continuity becomes visible again, the imagination loses part of its tendency to exaggerate threat. This allows the person to perceive circumstances with greater proportion. Courage then begins to appear not as forced effort, but as natural consequence of restored orientation. The individual may still recognize difficulty, but no longer interprets difficulty as abandonment. This distinction is essential. The Aramaic environment preserved expressions capable of reinforcing relational perception, reminding individuals that inner steadiness is strengthened when thought returns to what is constant rather than what is temporary. Through this perspective, Abba operates as a linguistic anchor that supports the transition from emotional turbulence toward stable awareness. When teachings emphasize continuity, they also emphasize patience. Stability is rarely rebuilt through urgency alone. It is reinforced through repeated remembrance of what has already demonstrated reliability. Abba reflects this pattern. Its force does not depend on dramatic intensity, but on faithful return to a perception of nearness and trust. In this way, courage becomes sustainable, because it is no longer dependent on changing emotion. It becomes rooted in remembered relationship. The continuity of this word across centuries demonstrates how language can preserve pathways that help the human spirit remain oriented even when circumstances remain uncertain. The journey through Abba reveals how ancient language preserved pathways that reconnect the individual with stability in moments when fear attempts to dominate perception. Within the Aramaic context, associated with Jesus, words functioned as bridges between memory and presence, ensuring that essential meanings remained accessible across generations. Abba expresses closeness, continuity, trust, and orientation, demonstrating that courage is often the result of remembered connection rather than sudden emotional force. The teachings surrounding this word indicate that fear weakens when the mind recovers its awareness of relationship with what is constant. Through continuity of language, the individual regains proportion, and through regained proportion, clarity returns. A simple protocol can help integrate this understanding into daily reflection. Begin by choosing a quiet moment in which external distraction is minimal. Allow the mind to slow its pace without forcing immediate silence. Gently bring attention to the meaning associated with Abba, recognizing the idea of nearness and continuity rather than distance and fragmentation. Repeat the word calmly, without urgency, allowing the sound to function as a reminder of stability. Instead of attempting to eliminate fear directly, allow attention to return toward trust. Continue for a few moments, observing how the inner atmosphere gradually reorganizes itself. This practice reflects the traditional understanding that courage grows as continuity of perception is restored. Through repetition, the word becomes familiar, and familiarity reinforces stability. In this way, Abba serves not as an escape from reality, but as a reminder that stability can coexist with uncertainty, allowing courage to emerge as a natural continuation of trust. Remember to visit my site to get your free Gnostic Awakening Guide. There you will also find my advanced ebooks for those ready to fully break the Archon Matrix and step into divine abundance. Everything you need is waiting for you. The link is right below. If this video opened something inside you, please like, share, and subscribe. Every week we go deeper into the hidden Aramaic words of Jesus, words spoken 2,000 years ago that are still alive and active today. Your journey into the light of Abba has only just begun.